What's going on, guys? Tyson the Trainer here, back with another episode of Sports Talk. Now, today we're going to be covering energy systems, right? Now, the reason I want to cover energy systems, and I know I've talked about this a little bit, it's a little bit different, okay? I've talked about how you can use fat and carbohydrates as a fuel source, but I want to dive a little bit more into that to help you understand why we want to make sure we're delineating between the two, and why carbohydrates, especially for an athlete, is so important. Because a lot of people, promote these low carbohydrate diets for athletes and things like that, and it's like, if you want to perform at your best, you need carbohydrates in your diet, okay? So firstly, energy systems, right? There are three different types of energy systems that we have. We have the ATP, PCR, I had a mind like that. We have the ATP PCR, right? Which is just a very short sprint, which would be like, 10 seconds max you're going to use this. So this is just ATP that you've got stored in your body, right? We always have ATP stored in our body. And if I was going to sprint for the next 10 seconds, I can use that energy system very, very quickly, okay? Now, the thing when I use this energy system is that I can't recycle that energy fast enough to keep continuing at that speed with the same recycling of energy, okay? So this is why we turn into our second system, which is called the Glycolytic System, right? Now, this uses carbohydrate as your fuel source. This is more of those intense type of trainings where you're trying to push a heart rate as high as you can. It may be a 400 meter sprint, those type of things. So it's a little bit longer in distance, but you're keeping that intensity quite high, right? Then we go to our third energy system. I'm having a mind blank here. We go to our third energy system, and this is where we can't recycle the energy again as fast, and our intensity is dropped, and we turn into using fat as our fuel source, and it's a lower time to turn over ATP, right? So if I was just trying to think about this, if I'm jogging like this, it's a light jog, I'm only using fat as my fuel source predominantly. I'm still going to be swapping between carbohydrates and fat, but fat is going to be my predominant fuel source, right? This way I can keep that intensity, which is quite low, and keep the pace and not start to fatigue anytime soon. Because my body has so much fat as a fuel source. It's got intramuscular triglycerides, can't even say that word, right? And it's got adipose tissue as fat. So we can always use fat as a fuel source, and that's why people can walk for long distances, lightly jog for long distances, all these things, because we're using fat as our fuel source for the most part. And fat just is we have way more fuel source than we have for carbohydrates. Okay? And again, there's only so much intensity we can keep at a carbohydrate before we hit a lactate threshold, or, again, just before we deplete all our muscle glycogen, and that's when we start to hit like a bit of a roadblock, right? So we have three different systems there that we have as just an overall energy system that our body uses, I guess I want to say. So we don't really think about the first 10 seconds, okay? Because again, they're just like, boom, there's just a quick run, it's a 100 meter sprint. It'd probably take me longer than 10 seconds to sprint to 100 meters. But it's that first initial 10 seconds. We don't need to worry about having any fuel sources for that, because you can just, boom, go, right? Now, the second system, the glycolytic system, the more intense type of thing, that's where we want to make sure we are actually keeping carbohydrates in our diet for this glycolytic system, okay? Because like I've said before, you can train yourself. Well, first you can train yourself to use fat at a higher intensity, right? Which is going to be good, because now you have more fat reserves. So if you can train yourself to use fat at a higher intensity, excellent. You can be able to push yourself harder. And this is why, marathon runners can do it in such a good amount of time, because they can sit on that threshold where they're using fat as their primary fuel source. They're not using muscle glycogen. But then, as the race starts to go in and they increase that intensity a little bit more, they will start using muscle glycogen, but they're swapping between both energy systems. And because their muscle glycogen is continuously topped up, you're actually able to perform better, right? So what I'm saying here with this glycolytic system, making sure we have carbohydrates in our body, that's what's going to be like the most important thing when you are going to do something intense, okay? So if I'm going to be doing boxing, right? I think I've talked about this again in the heart rate side of things. When we track our heart rate, we can see our energy systems that we're using, okay? So again, if I'm doing let's say 2 minute, 2 minute session, sparring, doing something, and then I'm breaking, I'm having a rest for a minute. That 2 minute session, my heart rate might be sitting really high, might be sitting that very high energetic state, which I'm using carbohydrates as my fuel source. But then, as I'm resting, it's coming back down, and I'm resting for a minute, and now I'm using fat as my fuel source. So in regards to saying that, I'm kind of mixing my fuel sources here, but predominantly, you're going to be using more carbohydrates overall. So we want to make sure we are having carbohydrates in our diet to be able to contract muscle, okay? Because when something is intense, right, and I'm using carbohydrates as my fuel source, I can recycle that ATP energy, or have ATP going recycled fast enough when I'm at this certain intensity. But as muscle glycogen starts to go down, muscle carbohydrates, I guess you would say, starts to deplete because I'm using it all the time. Again, in my arms, if I'm just fucking boxing, I'm contracting muscle. Every time I'm contracting muscle, I am using glycogen from my muscles, right? So I'm using this energy source. So I'm slowly depleting muscle glycogen because there's only so much carbohydrates we have in our muscle. And as this is depleting, I can't keep that same intensity, right? Because now I don't have the carbohydrates to continuously keep that cycle going. So my intensity drops and I start using fat as a fuel source. But again, I'm not as speedy, I'm not as quick, I slow down a little bit. And because my body just can't rejuvenate that energy quick enough, right? So in saying this, when our intensities go higher, we need carbohydrate as that fuel source if we want to make sure we're performing at our best, Any type of high intensity training or, competition, boxing, swimming, swimming 100%, short distance running, any of those things, like there's a little bit of a idea. There's obviously heaps of sports that do this. So think about things that are intense, that are short amount of bursts. Again, 2-minute rounds, 3-minute rounds, 4-minute rounds, things like that. You're going to be using carbohydrates primarily as a fuel source, okay? Another example, if you're rugby sevens, you are going to be running back and forth, right? You may not always be running as hard as you can. Sometimes, you'll be jogging backwards, jogging forwards. It's kind of light, but then there'll be times where you are going to be doing things quick. So you'll be someone who's utilizing carbohydrates and fats together as a fuel source, but it's still very important to have, both. So in this case, you still want to make sure you're drinking your Powerade, being hydrated and things like that on the field to obviously have the carbohydrate performance, but it's not just going to be carbohydrate dominant, if that makes sense, But again, if I was here and I was going to run a 400 meter sprint, you want to make sure you have topped up muscle glycogen because studies show if you go into an event pre-topped up with muscle glycogen, you will perform better overall. They've actually shown studies that we have our salivary glands. Even if you mouth rinse carbohydrates and you spit it out, you will actually perform better because your mouth senses carbohydrates, and carbohydrates, they're so important for our brain. Our brain runs off glucose. And then obviously when we have carbohydrates there, it's actually going to help reduce overall fatigue. So if you have lower glycogen stores or lower carbohydrate stores overall, you're actually going to have a higher rate of perceived exertion. So your training is actually going to be harder or feel harder overall. You're not going to be able to push as intensively. And you're not going to be able to perform at your best. So in saying this, knowing that our energy systems, based on basically that too, our carbohydrate system technically and our fat system, right? So knowing where you're going to be sitting in this, regards to what your sport is, and knowing how to apply that to you. Because at the end of the day, the better off you know how your energy system works, and the better you know about how it relates to your sport, the better you're going to be at your sport. I can be talking about a marathon, I could be talking about carbohydrates all the time and things like this, but a marathon runner who can train at a higher intensity at 75% of their heart rate max, and make sure they're having fat as their fuel source and their predominant fuel source, they're going to be able to just, keep going with fats for the most part. They are still going to obviously have carbohydrates during their workout because it'll still increase their performance overall, but they don't have to rely on that high intensity, 85% and above for fucking hours on end because they're not going to be able to do it, It's just impossible for them to be able to maintain such a high performance level with high intensity without depleting the muscle glycogen, okay? So for those people, they're obviously more conservative because it's a longer distance, but for people who are going to be doing more intense things, you want to make sure you are having carbohydrates, right? And I've talked about this, obviously fueling our carbohydrates in our session. So again, if you're a boxer, if you're swimming, if you're an MMA athlete, if you're someone who's doing these things on your rest times, sipping things like Powerade that have electrolytes, so it's got your sodium, your potassium, and also carbohydrates in there to hydrate you, firstly, but also secondly, making sure that you're able to fuel yourself and recover and get those carbohydrates in your body so they can be used as immediate sources of energy, okay? So knowing, where you kind of sit, and again, this is why it all comes back to maybe tracking your heart rate to see where your heart rate sits every day with what you're doing. There will be more intense runs. Are you getting that heart rate high enough to get into that carbohydrate zone? Again, above 65% of your heart rate max for most people is going to get more towards that predominant carbohydrate zone. But if you're getting fitter and you slowly increase that to 75%, using fat as your fuel source will be obviously the first thing you can use too, which will keep muscle glycogen, right, stored for the most part. You still use a little bit, but then you also have muscle glycogen stored up for when you want to do that, hard last push and you need to use those reserves, because with our muscle glycogen, it's always going to average based on how much we have, but it's like 400 to 600 grams, and like 600 grams of muscle glycogen, let's equate that. So let's say 1 gram of carbohydrates, right, is 4 calories. okay? 1 gram of carbohydrates holds 3 grams of water. So when saying that, 600 grams of glycogen is going to be the equivalent of 2,400 calories, you know? So 2,400 calories is quite a large period of time that you're going to be depleting full muscle glycogen, you know? But now it comes to the context of what you're doing. I'm boxing, right? If I'm using my hands, I'm still obviously using footwork, but guess what's depleting more muscle glycogen? My arms. If I'm running, I'm still doing this when I'm running, but I'm not contracting muscle as much as I'm contracting muscle with my legs, so I'm going to lose leg muscle glycogen faster. So even though we're thinking, let's just say someone has 600 grams of muscle glycogen, you know? Now you're only focusing on a certain part. I couldn't tell you how much muscle glycogen is going to be in your legs. Everyone's going to be different. But what I'm saying here is, again, so let's just say in your legs itself, let's say it's half. Let's just say it's 300 grams. Well, 300 grams of carbohydrates is only going to equal 1,200 calories, you know? And you can burn through 1,200 calories in about 70 to 80 minutes if you're keeping that intensity quite high. So you've just depleted all those muscle glycogen stores, and now your performance is going to go down, right? And this is why it's important, so we know where we keep our intensity and our heart rate, so we're not depleting muscle glycogen too quickly, especially if it's a longer term event. Or again, if it's a shorter term event, like shorter intervals and things like that, you know that you're going to be using muscle glycogen and you're keeping those topped up all the time, right? And this comes back to making sure your meals the night before are full of carbohydrates. And if you're going to train, obviously if you're going to eat before you're training, make sure that has a carbohydrate meal too. This way you're going to be topped up with muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, and have some blood glucose going around. So it's always important to kind of know where our energy systems are going to be used, how they're going to be used like on the days, and how we can alter our nutrition around that. Because as an athlete, the more specific you can get, especially this is your career and you're getting paid, you want to be able to nail as many things as you can. Okay? So again, in saying that, just kind of give you guys an idea, one other thing, when you are doing something, whatever it's going to be, let's say again, it is, I'll give you a perfect example. So let's say you're going to cycle, and the cycling is going to be 4 hours, you know, and you're keeping that heart rate at 75%. So you are actually teetering between that carbohydrate and that fat as a fuel source, and you're using that muscle glycogen, okay? What we want to start to do is refuel ourselves after that first hour mark. So usually within the first hour of your training, you're not going to really need to matter much about, you know, how much, if you're going to be drinking any carbohydrates or stuff like that. Like, it's always good to have something sipping on, and like, you know, Powerade is going to be an electrolyte too. Like, it's going to have electrolytes in it, so that's actually good for just rehydration and electrolytes overall. But it's like, I'm not relying just on carbohydrates. I'm just relying on thirst and obviously having electrolytes, okay? But after that hour mark, we should start looking at, you know, how much we can consume in that hour of carbohydrates in our body, right? So what they've found is that you can roughly, everyone's going to be different, but on average you can consume about 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So literally a gram a minute, okay? Now how do we apply this? Well, one Powerade bottle is about 30 grams of carbohydrates. So you could have 2 Powerade bottles in an hour. But one thing to also consider about that is that's quite a lot of liquid, right? And this is why we have those little energy gels you can get, and they're about 30 grams of carbohydrates per gel. So you can have two gels every hour, right? But here's another little trick for you. If you have fructose plus glucose, which you can actually, a lot of the gels now have, you can absorb up to 90 grams of carbohydrates an hour. So now you can have a little bit of extra carbohydrates. This way it means you're going to be continuously getting, like, you're digesting it and your body will use it straight as immediate energy, okay? Because based again on your intensity and how hard you can push yourself, you can burn a fair few calories per minute, right? So like, again, let me just give you an example. Let's say you were doing really intense work, your heart rate's very, very high, and you are burning 15 calories per minute, okay? Pretty fucking intense. You can go higher, but let's say 15 calories per minute. That's basically 4 grams of carbohydrates a minute that you're burning through. We can only consume 60 grams of carbohydrates, or 90 grams max in an hour, okay? But you're gonna be burning through, you know, again, so if I said 4 grams of carbohydrates a minute, right? Over an hour, so 4 times 6 is 240 grams of carbohydrates, right? So you've used 240 grams of carbohydrates in an hour, right? But you've only refueled with 60 grams of carbohydrates. So we're going to be having 60, or let's say 90 grams in this case. You're still going to be burning extra muscle glycogen. Do you know what I'm saying here? So there's only so much coming in, but we have more coming out, which means we're still going to be using muscle glycogen. And that's why when we train ourselves to higher, you know, being able to train at higher intensities with using fat as a fuel source, we can maintain that muscle glycogen for longer, which means it doesn't get depleted as quickly, which means you can hold your intensity higher because your muscle glycogen is staying not full, but still staying topped up, as well as the extra carbohydrates coming in. So that's also an important thing to note too, right? So knowing where our intensity is, knowing how many calories we're burning per minute, per hour, knowing to make sure we're trying to consume 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates within that hour after the first hour of training to keep it going overall, and this way you're going to be performing at your best, okay? And finally, in regards to the gels and stuff like that, do not be like, oh, I can have 60 grams an hour, bang, smash one on the first minute, and then on the 40th minute, you know? Have a little sip, put it back in your pocket, have a little sip later, you know, every 15 minutes, let's say you're having 2 gels, okay? 2 gels, or let's say 3 gels, okay? So it's 90 grams. 3 gels, you have one at the 20-minute mark, you have one at the 40-minute mark, you have one at the 60-minute mark, all right? So it kind of just spreads it out evenly, because if you have too much, you're also going to cause yourself GI issues. So that's the cover on energy systems. That's why we want to make sure we do know how we're using our energy in general and how it's all going to kind of come into play for you. So I hope that makes sense. I hope it was helpful. And if you guys have any questions, until next time, speak to you guys then.